I call the Honourable Clayton Cosgrove.
Mr Speaker, I don't disagree with many of the sentiments by the New Zealand First colleagues apart from one. We will be supporting this notice of motion. I don't agree that in supporting the notice of motion that it somehow validates or supports the selling off of state-owned assets. We're supporting this notice of motion simply because it will allow, through the Select Committee process, a modicum of scrutiny of the activities of this asset. We know that the Official Information Act and even parliamentary questions now, because of this government's wish to sell that asset off with the others as they did, it limits the scrutiny both of members of parliament, the general public, journalists and others. Under the guise of so-called increased scrutiny, the Minister of Finance says that the market somehow, the magic hand of the market, will provide that scrutiny through stockbrokers, analysts and others. I would wager that that scrutiny will be nowhere near the level of scrutiny that occurs in this place when ministers' feet are put to the fire before the Select Committee and this Parliament, when full disclosure can occur through parliamentary questions and Official Information Act requests. They are now limited, and there's no way that a broker or an analyst can provide the sort of, or would be interested in actually, many of the key pieces of information that members of Parliament and members of the public gain through the various mechanisms, the OIA, parliamentary questions and full Select Committee scrutiny, that will be lost because of the sell-off. So I say that in supporting, I make it very clear that in supporting this notice of motion, this party, the Labor Party, does in no way endorse the fire sale, the bargain basement sale that occurred as this government sold off asset after asset. Now let's look at the history. It was the Prime Minister who originally said, and we've got the quotes, originally said that the total asset sale proceeds would number in the order of 10. People forget this, $10 billion. Then that was revised down. Somebody tapped the Prime Minister on the shoulder, presumably Tony Ryle or Bill English, and said, "Taiho, bit over the top. That's a bit of propaganda. We need to ratchet back expectations." Then it went to $7 billion. Then it went to $6 billion. Then the range was revised again to $5 to $7 billion. Then it was revised down again to $6. And where did we get to when the government sold the final asset, that is Genesis Energy, after the raft of others, Mighty River, Meridian, Air New Zealand? Well, they got to $4.7 billion. Bargain basement prices. My word, the warehouse as an entity would be proud of the fact that Bill English, maybe he should go back into a business, a mail order business or a discount business or selling Tupperware or something, I don't know, because my word, can this guy get a huge discount on the assets he sells. And I've got to say, the gall of Mr English to say we're sort of tidying things up. This is not a tidy up. This is an attempted clean-up of one of the biggest stuff-ups in the history of this Parliament. We've already heard the Green colleague talk about the wasted hundreds of millions of dollars in costs to get these assets away. But when you break it down, Bill English talks about the fact that he's prudent with the purse. He talked in a sort of voice-breaking tones about the $300. Every $300 is important to the average Kiwi, and he's right about that. So my question is, how does he explain the Rio Tinto deal when he gave Rio Tinto $30 million? And here are the facts on that. Rio Tinto didn't even ask for the $30 million that he gave them. They didn't ask for it in the deal. Nowhere does it appear in the deal. The halving of the notice period does, the cheaper electricity price does, but nowhere in the deal, I'm advised, did Rio Tinto put their hand out and say, "We'd like $30 million. It was a free gift, and Bill English talks about being prudent about every $300 that the government spends on behalf of taxpayers. So he doled out $30 million to them that they didn't ask for, and then he came into the Parliament and went round New Zealand and said this was a prudent spend of money because this guaranteed the Southland jobs. And we know that was a lie. It was an absolute lie, because on Catherine Ryan's show, he was asked by Catherine Ryan, "Did you ask for a jobs guarantee?" And he said, "No, I didn't, and I didn't get one." So that was a lie, absolute, unequivocal, from his own lips. So you tell me, Mr Speaker, how that is a prudent use of taxpayers' money. And then the government made an argument to say, oh, look, we're selling these assets because we've got this future investment fund and we will be buying new assets. Isn't this a good thing? In a sort of blind attempt to hoodwink the taxpayer. But the taxpayer worked out, as evidenced by the referendum, that when you sell a revenue-generating asset and you buy non-revenue-generating assets, and last time I checked, public hospitals and schools and the like were not revenue-generating entities. They were taxpayer-funded entities designed to make people healthy and to educate kids. When you buy non-revenue-generating assets after you've sold revenue-generating assets, we problem. At the end of the day, the slush fund runs out, no more money. And these turkeys over here did it in the 1990s. They learned absolutely nothing from it. And I say to Mr English, if this policy is so remarkably successful, why is it that when you and your mates, Jim Bolger and the like, flogged off all the assets in the 90s, what happened? Where's the success? It's Groundhog Day and we're back here again with the same national cronies, same guys who were there under Jim Bolger, selling things off again. And these guys are good, I've got to say. When it comes to the old pyramid scheme, these boys are phenomenally professional. Because if you look at the promises that were made in respect of the Future Investment Fund, the promises, if you take them at face value, National have promised on the latest count $80 billion worth of spending from proceeds of $4.7 billion. We had promises from John Key that they'd fund Kiwibank in 2011. 2012, Tony Riles said that the asset sales were necessary to pay down debt. Then in 2012, John Key said, no, the asset sales are for new hospitals and schools. Stephen Joyce in the same year said, no, we've got to use some of this money to fund KiwiRail. Nathan Guy in 2013 said, no, some of this money will be to subsidise irrigation schemes, multi-million-dollar schemes for farmers. Then Jerry Brownlee, the big fella himself, came in and said, no, the asset sales money will be used to rebuild Christchurch. And then John Key in June 2013 said the asset sales would be used in part to fund the Auckland Rail Link. And then you have a look at some of the other little missives that they put in, and remember this asset sales money was all about big investments, schools, hospitals, all this sort of thing. But then you get into the sort of additional asset sales proceeds that they've paid for, not to mention the $100-odd million that they appropriated, of course, to try and stabilise Solid Energy, which Tony Ryle and Bill English stood by and watched the then directors and then management run into the ground to the tune of 800 to 1,000 jobs and counting. Those poor people who I'm sure are watching every $300 they make, if they do, through the unemployment benefit, when they get to $300, I'm sure they're taking due care with every $300 that they're lucky enough to scrape up given they've lost their jobs. But you have a look at some of the other stuff, Mr Speaker. $40 million for the bonuses for Mighty River Power. This is what they spent the taxpayers' money on from these proceeds. Replacement of the refugee resettlement facilities, immigration management systems, closed captioning on Parliament TV. Can't remember that in the last National Party manifesto in terms of a major sort of investment from the Future Investment Fund. Replacement of ground station for search and rescue satellite systems. Replacement of something called Matriarch system in the Debt Management Office. The whole of government radio network. Analysis of outcomes cabinet investment function, whatever that means. And a computer system for the Cabinet, presumably so Bill English can actually tot up all the dough that he's wasted from the sale of these assets, and a few other obligations to the IMF. Now, you tell me, Mr Speaker and colleagues, where that was mentioned in the list of assets that the Future Investment Fund would use in respect of these sales. The truth is that the people of New Zealand owned these assets. For generations they had paid for them, through blood, sweat and tears, through generations of people. The truth is that Bill English was generous enough to say, I'm going to allow you to spend your own money, the big end of town of course, to buy what you already own back again. And what's happened is a wealth transfer and an asset transfer where every Kiwi and every member of our community owned these assets down to the privileged few. Down to the privileged few who pay for the so-called free shares, which have never been free. They are paid for by the people who could not afford to buy or did not wish to buy shares in these particular assets. And all the bonuses, the loyalty bonuses, remember, will expire a few months after the next general election. A few months after the loyalty bonuses expire, and I make this prediction, sir, those shares, as soon as the bonuses are picked up when the expiry happens, will wing their way to New York, London, Tokyo, just like Contact Energy.
Question is that the motion be agreed to. Those of that opinion will say aye. Contrary, no. The ayes have it. Call on Government Order of the Day number 2.
Interrupted debate on the second reading of the Accounting Infrastructure Reform Bill.